The majority of motorists believe the instant those emergency lights emerge in their rear mirror, the result is already determined: a citation, perhaps a caution, a brief period on the roadside, and then it concludes. Curious, but what if that complete belief is incorrect? What if the most crucial aspect of that encounter occurs before the citation is even issued, before you even comprehend anything significant is transpiring? Because every individual day across American roadways, motorists unknowingly utter one statement, just one, that silently surrenders their legal safeguard. Sighs, and from that instant forward, the detention is no longer merely a detention. It transforms into something else completely. Examinations occur, duration extends, circumstances intensify, and the motorist typically has no understanding why situations suddenly went problematic. This isn't about extreme situations or uncommon occurrences. This is transpiring to regular individuals on completely routine drives. The disturbing aspect is how foreseeable it is. The identical sequences, the identical errors, the identical results. And virtually nobody observes it approaching until it's already too late. But once you comprehend precisely what's transpiring in those initial instances and the particular regulation that controls everything, you begin to perceive the complete encounter differently. And more significantly, you comprehend how a few deliberately selected words can entirely alter the trajectory of that detention before it ever has an opportunity to escalate. Welcome to US Visa and Green Card Info, and we've dedicated a considerable amount of time examining actual traffic detention recordings, over 200 body camera recordings, deconstructing precisely what transpires during those critical initial minutes on the roadside. And what emerged wasn't forceful enforcement or theatrical confrontations. It was something considerably quieter and far more reliable. The motorists who concluded in the worst circumstances weren't necessarily executing anything significantly improper. They just didn't comprehend how the encounter actually functions. They responded to inquiries the way most individuals would. They attempted to be accommodating, collaborative, truthful, and paradoxically, that's precisely what positioned them at a disadvantage. In this video, we're going to demonstrate the particular highway regulation dynamic that most motorists have never been instructed, the 3 precise phrases that can safeguard you immediately during a detention, and how a circumstance that typically continues for 20 minutes can instead be concluded in less than 8. By the conclusion of this, you're going to observe traffic detentions in a completely different manner, and you'll understand precisely what to articulate and when to articulate it, so you're not caught unprepared the subsequent time those lights activate behind you. Here's where most individuals get it incorrect, and it's not because they're negligent. It's because they've been conditioned to believe a traffic detention is straightforward. You get detained, deliver your license and registration, respond to a few inquiries, and wait for the officer to determine what transpires next. It feels standard, almost mechanical. But that interpretation of reality excludes something critical. A traffic detention is not merely a roadside dialogue. It's an organized legal encounter with very particular parameters. And those parameters are being evaluated from the very initial second. Officers are instructed to utilize the opening instances of a detention to accomplish more than validate a violation. They're monitoring your conduct, your inflection, your replies, even your hesitation. Every word you articulate is being analyzed, not casually, but as potential evidence. And while most motorists believe they're just being courteous or collaborative, what's actually transpiring is that they're unknowingly assisting construct a legal foundation that can warrant extending the detention far beyond its initial intention. This is where federal highway enforcement procedures intersect directly with your constitutional protections, specifically your Fourth Amendment safeguard against unreasonable examinations and detentions. And that intersection is precisely where situations begin to transition, because once that initial intention of the detention, say excessive speed or a malfunctioning taillight, starts to become unclear, the complete encounter can broaden. More inquiries, more examination, more duration. And it frequently begins so subtly that motorists don't even recognize the transformation. But if you understand what to search for, you'll observe that it almost always commences the identical way, with one inquiry that sounds benign, almost conversational, but carries far more significance than individuals comprehend. It typically arrives within seconds of the officer approaching your window. You've probably encountered it before, or you will at some point. Do you understand why I detained you today? On the exterior, it registers like a fundamental, even respectful way to initiate the encounter. But this is not casual conversation. This is one of the most dependable and widely utilized approaches in any traffic detention because of what it encourages you to execute next. The instant you reply with anything particular, you're no longer just responding to an inquiry. You're potentially making a verbal acknowledgement, and that carries more weight than most motorists comprehend. If you articulate, "I believe I was traveling a little rapid," you've just acknowledged excessive speed without observing any proof. If you articulate, "I might have drifted a bit," you've supplied a rationale that can be utilized to support further investigation. These declarations don't just vanish. They get recorded, incorporated in reports, and can later be referenced in court as component of the officer's documentation of the detention. And the explanation this functions so reliably is because it registers natural. Individuals want to be agreeable. They want to appear truthful, so they complete the silence with clarifications that seem benign in the instant, but carry genuine legal significance. Now, compare that to a reply that maintains the encounter respectful without surrendering anything away. Instead of speculating or acknowledging, you articulate, "Officer, I'm willing to collaborate fully. I don't believe I was executing anything improper." That one statement accomplishes something substantial. It demonstrates you're composed. You're not opposing, but you're also not offering information that could be utilized against you. You're permitting the officer to declare their explanation based on their monitoring, not your presumption. And that difference carries weight because now the trajectory of the detention is based on proof, not your own words. Legally, this corresponds with your Fifth Amendment safeguard against self-accusation. And courts have reliably recognized that roadside questioning still carries those implications. So, in that initial exchange, those initial few seconds, you're establishing the foundation for everything that precedes. Most motorists don't comprehend it, but this is the instant where the complete trajectory of the detention begins to take formation. And once you observe how much depends on that one reply, it becomes evident why getting it correct carries such importance. What renders this so effective and so hazardous isn't just the inquiry itself. It's everything transpiring around it. The inflection is composed. The environment feels standard. There's no apparent pressure, no elevated voices, no perception that anything significant is developing. And that's precisely why it functions. Because while you're believing this is just a regular detention, the officer is already evaluating far more than your response. They're monitoring how rapidly you reply, whether you hesitate, how confident or uncertain you sound, even how your physical language corresponds with what you're articulating. From a legal perspective, this is where the encounter starts to take formation. There's a distinction between what an officer can establish through monitoring and what you willingly supply through your own words. The instant you present an acknowledgement, even a minor one, you've altered that equilibrium. You've made their responsibility easier. You've completed gaps that they would otherwise have to warrant on their own. But when you utilize a controlled reply, something composed, respectful, and non-binding, you alter that dynamic completely. Now, the officer has to depend on what they actually monitored, not what you presumed or acknowledged. And that individual transition can restrict how far the detention can reasonably proceed. This isn't about being difficult or evasive. It's about comprehending that every encounter has a framework, and once you recognize it, you can navigate through it without unintentionally generating problems for yourself. Most motorists never comprehend how much influence they possess in those initial instances because it doesn't register like influence. It registers like responding to a straightforward inquiry. But in reality, it's the initial point where the trajectory of the complete detention can either remain narrow or begin to broaden. And that expansion is where the subsequent layer arrives. Because once the initial inquiry passes, the detention doesn't just pause, it develops. This is the aspect most individuals don't recognize while it's transpiring. The officer might commence asking what seem like casual, benign inquiries. Where are you traveling? Where are you arriving from? How long have you been operating today? On the exterior, it registers like dialogue, perhaps even an attempt to be friendly. But legally, something very particular is transpiring in the background. These inquiries are being utilized to establish what's recognized as reasonable suspicion, a threshold that permits an officer to extend the detention beyond its initial intention. And this is where a standard traffic detention can quietly transform into something considerably longer and considerably more intrusive. Because once that initial explanation for detaining you, say excessive speed, has been addressed, the officer cannot legally maintain you there without a fresh warranted explanation. That principle was made evident in a Supreme Court situation called Rodriguez versus United States. The determination established that a traffic detention must remain connected to its initial intention, and extending it even by a few minutes demands independent warrant. But here's the complication. Most motorists never challenge that extension, not because they consent with it, but because they don't comprehend they can. They remain there responding to more inquiries, waiting for the encounter to conclude, presuming the officer controls the timeline completely. In reality, you possess a method to bring the detention back to its legal parameter, and it comes down to one straightforward direct inquiry. At the suitable instant, once your documents have been delivered and the explanation for the detention has been established, you ask, "Officer, am I permitted to depart once you've concluded with my documents?" That's it. No demeanor, no intensification, just an evident inquiry. And what that accomplishes is subtle but substantial. It indicates that you comprehend the detention has a specified scope and a natural endpoint. It positions the accountability back on the officer to either conclude the detention or clearly express why it's being extended. Compare that to what most motorists execute, which is nothing. They wait, they respond, they comply without ever clarifying the timeline. And in that silence, the detention stretches. More inquiries get asked, more duration passes, and by the conclusion of it, what should have been a rapid encounter has transformed into something far more prolonged. But when you ask that one inquiry, you're not opposing. You're anchoring the encounter to its legal restrictions. And that alone can alter how long you're remaining on the side of that roadway. To genuinely comprehend how substantial that one inquiry is, you have to observe how little duration it actually requires for a detention to exceed the boundary. In the Rodriguez situation, the distinction wasn't theatrical. There was no high-speed pursuit, no significant intensification, no apparent turning point. It was just an additional 7 to 8 minutes after the initial intention of the detention had already been fulfilled. 7 minutes. That was sufficient for the Supreme Court to intervene and declare the extension was unlawful because it wasn't supported by independent reasonable suspicion. Consider that for a second. Most motorists wouldn't even question a delay like that. It registers minor. You're already detained, already waiting, so what's a few more minutes? But legally, those minutes carry weight. They are the distinction between a legitimate detention and a violation of your protections. And the explanation that boundary gets exceeded so frequently is because nobody challenges it in actual time. Not forcefully, not confrontationally, just clearly. When you ask, "Am I permitted to depart once you concluded with my documents?" You're executing precisely what that situation safeguards. You're drawing attention to the timeline. You're making it evident that you comprehend the detention has a beginning, an intention, and a conclusion. And in numerous situations, that's sufficient to bring situations back on course. Officers understand the benchmark. They understand the parameter. But if it's never acknowledged, it becomes simple for the detention to drift beyond it without opposition. That's why this inquiry functions. It doesn't generate conflict. It generates clarity. And clarity in a circumstance like this is one of the most valuable instruments you possess. Now, here's where everything concentrates, because there's one instant in a traffic detention where the complete circumstance can transition in seconds. No accumulation, no caution, just an individual inquiry that determines what transpires next. And it typically sounds casual, almost like it's already been determined. The officer might articulate, "You object if I take a rapid examination inside your automobile?" Or, "I'm just going to inspect your vehicle real rapid." Okay, the inflection is relaxed. The wording is gentle. And that final okay is accomplishing more work than most individuals comprehend. It's designed to guide you into agreement before you've even had an opportunity to consider it through. Because legally, if the officer doesn't possess a warrant and doesn't possess probable cause, they require one component to examine your automobile: your permission. That's it. And once you provide it, even casually, even unintentionally, the complete safeguard that would normally apply is eliminated. Most motorists don't refuse in that instant, not because they desire the examination, but because it registers awkward to articulate no. They believe, I've got nothing to conceal, or they presume compliance will make the detention proceed faster. So, they articulate, sure, proceed ahead. Or they gesture, or they exit the vehicle without comprehending what they've just consented to. And from that point forward, the examination is legally warranted, not because of proof, but because of authorization. Now, compare that to a reply that maintains everything within your control. When asked, you articulate clearly and calmly. Officer, I do not authorize to any examinations. No clarification, no additional words, just that statement. And what transpires next is immediate. The dynamic alters because now instead of depending on your authorization, the officer has to depend on legal warrant. They either require probable cause or the detention proceeds without an examination. That one statement compels the encounter back into a structure where your protections are fully intact. And this isn't a loophole or a technique. It's a principle that's been sustained for generations. In Schneckloth versus Bustamante, the Supreme Court made it evident that permission must be willing, which indicates it can also be refused calmly, legally, without consequence on its own. And when you comprehend that, the pressure to consent in that instance starts to vanish because now you're not reacting. You're making a determination, one that maintains the complete circumstance from broadening beyond what the regulation actually permits. Once you comprehend that instant, everything about a traffic detention starts to register different because what used to seem like a courteous request now reveals itself as a turning point. The moment you clearly articulate, I do not authorize to any examinations, you've accomplished something most motorists never execute. You've transferred the responsibility back where it belongs. Up until that point, the encounter frequently leans on your collaboration to navigate forward. But once permission is off the consideration, the officer has to depend on something else completely, actual expressible probable cause. And if that isn't there, the pathway forward becomes considerably narrower. This is why that individual statement carries so much significance. It doesn't intensify the circumstance, and it doesn't generate conflict. It merely defines a parameter. And when that parameter is evident, the complete foundation of the detention frequently alters. In evaluating hundreds of actual traffic detentions, one sequence emerges again and again. Motorists who courteously but firmly refuse permission tend to experience shorter, more concentrated encounters. Not because they're being treated differently, but because the scope of what can legally transpire has been restricted. There's no longer an open invitation to investigate beyond the initial explanation for the detention. The encounter remains contained, and that's the objective. Not to succeed the encounter, not to challenge authority, but to navigate through it without unintentionally broadening it. Most individuals never observe this difference because they've been instructed that collaboration indicates agreement. But those are not the identical component. You can be fully collaborative, supplying documents, following instructions, remaining respectful while still declining requests that proceed beyond what's demanded. And that equilibrium is where your control originates from. It's not about articulating more. It's about understanding precisely what not to articulate. Now, to observe how all of this unfolds in actual duration, imagine a completely regular circumstance. You're on the highway, a few hours into a drive, perhaps contemplating where you're going to halt next. You drift slightly over the speed restriction. Nothing theatrical, but sufficient to attract attention. An instant later, you observe the lights. You detain, heart rate increasing just a bit, but nothing registers out of the regular yet. The officer approaches, and like countless detentions before the initial inquiry arrives, do you understand why I detained you? In one interpretation of this scenario, the manner it transpires for most motorists, you respond rapidly, attempting to be truthful and collaborative. Yeah, I believe I was traveling a little rapid. It registers benign, even accountable. But in that instant, you've just validated the violation before anything else has been established. The officer acquires your documents, returns to the automobile, and when they return, the inquiries continue. Where are you traveling? Where are you arriving from? You respond each one, completing the silence, attempting to be accommodating. A few minutes pass, then arrives the transition. You object if I take a rapid examination inside your vehicle? It's phrased casually, almost like a formality. And because everything has registered standards so far, you articulate, sure. What proceeds is a 20-plus minute examination on the side of the roadway. Nothing is discovered, but the duration is eliminated. The anxiety has accumulated, and the circumstance has stretched far beyond what you anticipated when you initially detained. Now execute that identical scenario again, but this time with a different strategy. The lights activate, you detain, and the officer asks the identical opening inquiry, but instead of speculating, you reply calmly. Officer, I'm willing to collaborate fully. I don't believe I was executing anything improper. There's no acknowledgement, no attached clarification, just an evident, controlled reply. You supply your documents, and once the explanation for the detention is established, you ask, am I permitted to depart? Once you concluded with my documents, the inquiry arrives simply without tension. The officer proceeds with the citation or caution, whatever the initial intention demanded. Then arrives the identical request. You object if I take an examination inside your automobile, and this time you respond just as clearly. Officer, I do not authorize to any examinations. No apology, no rationale, just the parameter. And from there, the encounter remains precisely where it was intended to remain. No extended delay, no unnecessary intensification. Within minutes, you're back on the roadway. Identical highway, identical initial detention. Completely different result. And the distinction wasn't fortune or timing or even the officer. It was 3 statements. 3 instances where the trajectory of the detention could have transitioned but didn't, because you comprehended what was transpiring as it was transpiring. And once you observe that contrast side by side, it becomes very evident just how much control most motorists are unknowingly surrendering away and how easily that can alter. At this point, you might be questioning whether all of this is just approach or if it's actually grounded in something solid. And that's a significant difference because none of what you've observed here depends on loopholes or technicalities. This is constructed on well-established legal principles that have been clarified over generations through Supreme Court determinations. When you select not to respond to an inquiry with an acknowledgement, you're corresponding with your Fifth Amendment safeguard against self-accusation, which applies even during roadside questioning. In Berkmare v. McCarty, the court made it evident that the pressures of a traffic detention don't eliminate those safeguards simply because you're not inside a police facility. When you ask whether you're permitted to depart once your documents are analyzed, you're reinforcing the benchmark outlined in Rodriguez v. United States, that a detention must remain connected to its initial intention and cannot be extended without independent warrant. And when you decline an examination, you're exercising a protection affirmed in Schneckloff v. Bustamante, where the court validated that permission must be willing, indicating it can also be refused. Even the wider structure of brief detentions outlined in situations like Terry v. Ohio supports the concept that these encounters have restrictions. Taken collectively, these determinations don't just exist in theory, they formation how every lawful traffic detention is supposed to operate in practice. And once you comprehend that foundation, the complete encounter becomes less uncertain. You're no longer speculating your manner through it. You're functioning within a framework that already exists to safeguard you. And this is where a minor transition in consciousness can make a lasting distinction. Because the reality is most motorists will never be instructed this. Not in motorist education, not in standard dialogues, not even after years of being on the roadway. It's something individuals typically discover the difficult manner after a circumstance stretches further than anticipated. But it doesn't have to be that manner. If you've made it this far, you already comprehend more about how these encounters function than the vast majority of motorists out there. And more significantly, you understand how rapidly situations can alter based on just a few words. If you want to proceed deeper into scenarios like this, particularly the ones where officers claim they detect something originating from the automobile, which introduces a completely different layer of legal complexity. Ensure you're following along on U.S. visa and green card info, so you don't miss that breakdown, because that's one of the most misunderstood circumstances motorists encounter, and it's where these principles get evaluated in a very genuine manner. For now, just concentrate on securing what you've already discovered, because the value isn't just in comprehending it here. It's in remembering it when it actually carries weight. By now, everything arrives down to simplicity. Not more information, not more complexity, just 3 evident instances and 3 precise statements that anchor the complete encounter. Because when those lights activate behind you, you're not going to be contemplating about court situations or legal theory. You're going to be reacting. And that's why this has to be simple to recall. The initial instant is the inquiry you'll almost always encounter. Do you understand why I detained you? Instead of speculating, instead of completing the silence, you remain controlled and articulate. Officer, I'm willing to collaborate fully. I don't believe I was executing anything improper. No acknowledgement, no presumptions, just a steady reply that maintains everything grounded. The subsequent instant arrives after the intention of the detention is evident and your documents are in procedure. This is where duration can quietly stretch if nothing is articulated. So you bring clarity to it with one inquiry. Am I permitted to depart once you've concluded with my documents? That individual line draws a parameter without generating tension. And the third instant, the one that can alter everything instantly, is the examination request. However it's phrased, however casual it sounds, your reply remains the identical. Officer, I do not authorize to any examinations. No additional words, no clarifications, just an evident determination that maintains your safeguards intact. Free statements, that's it. Not complex, not forceful, not confrontational, just accurate. And when you position them collectively, they generate a completely different type of encounter. One where you're collaborative but not vulnerable, respectful but not unprotected. Because at the conclusion of the day, nothing about this is theoretical. This is about an instant that could transpire anytime you're on the roadway on a long drive, a short commute, a completely regular day. And in that instant, the distinction between a standard detention and a prolonged stressful circumstance frequently arrives down to what you articulate before you even comprehend it carries weight. Most individuals don't contemplate it until after the reality when they're replaying the encounter in their head, questioning how it intensified or why it required so long. But now you won't be in that position. You'll recognize the framework as it's transpiring. You'll understand where the turning points are. And more significantly, you'll understand precisely how to navigate through them without unintentionally making situations more difficult on yourself. If there's one component to carry with you from this, it's that consciousness generates options. It provides you space to reply instead of react, and that alone can alter the complete experience. So the subsequent time you observe those lights, it won't register unpredictable. It'll register familiar, controlled, defined, and you'll understand precisely what to execute.